Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode, which will look at feminist and colonial discourses in India. Feminist and colonial discourses lend important perspectives which allow us to look at society and politics in newer ways. In this episode, we will unpack some aspects associated with the intersection of these themes with policy and politics in the Indian context. To discuss these themes today, we have with us Dr. Suruchi Thapar-Bjorkert. Dr. Suruchi is an associate professor at the Department of Government at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Suruchi.
Thank you so much, Saeed, for having me and for facilitating this discussion.
We'll start by talking about feminist discourses in India. So I would like to hear from you. How would you describe feminist discourses in India, and what are some of the new emerging ideas and how are they taking shape?
That's a very interesting question, Saeed. So I would like to begin by saying that how the historical trajectory of feminist discourse in India is diverse and complex. And I would like to address this diversity and complexity through the lens of what I call intersectionality of oppressions. Within this framework of intersectionality of oppressions, I would bring in the first idea, which I have in my writing called cartographies of violence. Now, cartographies of violence encompasses a range of issues such as sexual violence, domestic violence, sex determination, sex pre-selection, sexuality rights, and transnational surrogacy and reproductive justice, just to cite a few examples. Let me address two of these issues. One is on sexual violence and the other one is reproductive justice through a feminist lens. Now, from the 1970s, feminists politicized the discourse of rape, questioning the patriarchal power, privilege, and control over women and their bodies. A turning point was the Delhi gang rape case of 2012, which not only shook the nation, but it pointed to the force of feminist endeavors and shaped the language of activism and resistance. And here, what we saw was a very key component was women's right and access to public spaces and also living a life free from fear. So, in a nutshell, the feminist response has been integral for interpreting the dominant discourse of rape, but also questioning the laws that are not able to curtail this violation. Yeah, this is an ongoing, every day our news is inundated with episodes of rape and sexual violation. So continuing with this, through a lot of protests, the Justice Verma Committee, which was set up by the government, and this was headed by Chief Justice of India, J.S. Verma. So they had recommendations which basically targeted the patriarchal underpinnings of criminal laws. What we saw was that the Criminal Law Amendment Ordinance of 2013, which was promulgated by the then President of India, Pranab Mukherjee, was much more modest than that recommended by the Verma Committee, because it left issues of marital rape, it left issues of special powers of the army through the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, unaddressed. So in relation to the legislation on rape, while women's activism and intense lobbying has moved us a bit further, there are still legal gaps that need to be addressed. And it's also important to point out that how the reaction to sexual violation from various political quarters was so emblematic of discourses and viewpoints embedded within the narrative of the nation, but also the discontent that was bubbling under the surface for so many years on the structural violence embedded in state institutions. Nonetheless, something that I would like to bring up in our discussion today is that the Nirbhaya case raised an important issue of caste. So the question that I would like to pose is, why were there no similar national protests for example, when in 2006 the Bhotmange massacre took place in Maharashtra, or the Badaun killings in Uttar Pradesh in 2014, the Kathua gang rape, and the most recent sexual assault and parading naked of minority Kuki women by the majority Meitei men in Manipur, as we are seeing right now on our TV screens. So, as to this, I would like to add that, we are all aware that caste conflicts, primarily rural, are often mapped onto the sexualized bodies of Dalit, tribal, or minority populations, but they do not gain the visibility or public protest that the Nirbhaya case received. Why? Perhaps if caste frames the identity of the victim rather than gender and social oppression, it may generate different response or even lack of adequate response. So this has been an issue, an ongoing debate within the feminist circle. The second issue is of reproductive justice. As we are all aware, the Indian Surrogacy Regulation Bill was approved and passed as law in December 2020, restricting surrogacy to altruistic arrangements for heterosexual Indian couples with documented infertility. But what we see is that this new legal landscape in India is creating new transnational economies of exploitation and impacting some of the world's most vulnerable populations. The 2020 bill, it has been heavily criticized by feminists for increasing the vulnerability and exploitation of surrogates. Emerging research, such as my ongoing research, it indicates that altruistic surrogacy in India, it still entails an instrumentalization of women's reproductive capacities for securing their families' futures, while simultaneously making the terms of their labor more insecure and removing all state responsibility. So this has been again a subject of feminist debate and feminist concern. So what we see now is something quite insidious. What we see is that how the Indian reproductive industry, it's circumventing the law, the 2020 bill, by restructuring its operations within the country and relocating to other countries in the global south, such as Myanmar, Kenya, and Uganda. Also, lastly, I would like to say here that if you relocate certain procedures abroad, it allows the industry to continue to employ traveling surrogates and egg donors commercially. And it also blinds us from the precarious working environments that are so similar to the insecure working conditions of other migrant female care workers from the global south.
Those are some really thought-provoking ideas, and how you described the entire framework, I think, around intersectionality of suppression. I would like to move this a little bit towards policy now. And there is increasingly an understanding that bringing a gendered lens is very important in designing policies that are both effective and equitable. And some of your work in India has looked at themes of marginalization and empowerment, and how that intersects with government policies such as the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So, taking that as an example, how does Indian policymaking fare, or how has it evolved when we look at it through a gendered lens?
Thank you, Saeed. That's a really important question in relation to social protection schemes. I would like to actually start here addressing this important question by just laying out a little bit of the background, that how the inclusion of women's empowerment, first in the Millennium Development Goals in 2000 and later as Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, it really marked the recognition and the increasing importance of the concept of empowerment within the field of development. What we see is that empowerment of women is also at the core of social protection schemes in developing economies such as India, and it is viewed as an important instrument to address social challenges and providing the poor with the much desired safety nets. Now, if you look at just for example, Manrega, it's an employment guarantee scheme which is both rights-based and demand-based and holds immense transformative potential for enhancing economic and social security on the one hand and achieving gender equitable development outcomes on the other, of which women's empowerment is a critical element. Manrega, and also to highlight that it's the largest rural employment program, one of the largest in the world. When it was enacted in 2006, it actually opened a very new chapter in rural governance with the focus on marginalized communities, especially women, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and it conferred to every household living in rural areas the right to be employed in unskilled manual labor on public works for 100 days per year and to be paid a statutory minimum wage equal for men and women. Now, the latter is very important for my research, that it ensured equality, gender equality through the wage economy. I would like to share some key findings from a collaborative project which was conducted with Diego Mariano and Hans Blomqvist at Uppsala University. First, a key finding was that the social protection schemes, they expand the notion of public space for women and they enable them to get acquainted with the language of rights. And this is very important because rural landscape is very different from the urban landscape, and that was also an issue that I was trying to raise in your previous question, Saeed, that we do not hear about violence in rural contexts, but urban violence is very much significantly has a public face. So this was very important for women in the rural areas to understand what are their rights. Furthermore, these schemes also provide income security and an independent source of income, which arguably reduces women and marginalized groups' dependency on more powerful actors such as husbands, for example, if you look at the household domain, or upper or intermediate caste landowners and money lenders. And if you're looking at these actors, then you're looking at the community and the market domains, right? Overall, reduced dependency nonetheless does not necessarily translate into greater freedom or empowerment, because at times the reduced dependency has paradoxical effects that result in a deteriorating of the situation, particularly in terms of intra-household relations. Now, this is an important finding, which actually also points to the fact that how empowerment has to be seen as a process. So when you see empowerment as a process, then you're able to see that both empowerment and disempowerment are embedded within that process. Second point is that how social norms remain a potent source of disempowerment. And while policies like Manrega in India, they can contribute slowly to these changing norms, it is very clear that the precarity and poverty that affects the majority of the Dalit community is still an impediment to challenging oppressive social structures. Nonetheless, on the positive side, we would like to highlight a process, what we call politics of negotiation, which is redefining relationships between lower and upper caste and the parallel relationship between agricultural laborers and the landed elite. So, in other words, this is important because we are looking at here the redistribution of the means of production, which perhaps on some levels remains completely unchanged, but there is a marked difference in the way in which everyday interactions and associated social norms are experienced. So this is the change that we would like to highlight. But at the same time alerting that social protection schemes may not radically restructure social power, but they create spaces for women and socially marginalized communities to assert, to negotiate, and to get their voices across. Third point is that the quantitative empowerment score that we have developed, which measures people's empowerment across different domains. So here, the household, the community, and the market domain I was highlighting. Now, this empowerment score is a tool that can assist in directing government's attention to work with marginalized communities in making choices they want to make, rather than pressing them into making choices that they do not value. Thus, the empowerment score is also useful to identify who the disempowered individuals are and what areas their disempowerment is more severe. This can be valuable for policy decisions to ensure that marginalized communities are not disempowered further.
Those are some really important and valuable findings, and how overlapping identities function in different spaces. Now I'd like to move the conversation towards colonial discourses. How do you see anti-colonialism and nationalism interact in India? Anti-colonial rhetoric is often used by governments to shore up nationalist support. How would you look at this tendency in India, and how do we distinguish between the two?
Another excellent question, Saeed, and I must admit that this was the one that I had to give a lot of thought, because I found it also very difficult question, which is a little paradoxical because it also borders on my doctoral research, but nonetheless very important. So here I would like to start by saying that how examining nationalism within anti-colonial context, one could easily argue that the form and shape that national movements take is very much influenced by the colonial regimes that they seek to overcome, just as a starting point. Now, the primary goal of anti-colonial national movement, as we all know, is the ejection of the colonizer and the re-establishment of a sovereign nation state with full legislative powers over the territory and people within its national boundaries. Okay, so this is nothing new. But the nation state that was ultimately established in India was not identical to the aspirational nation that had been fought for. Now, this has remained a highly contested issue on various quarters. I would like to look at the marriage between anti-colonialism and nationalism. I would like to provoke by saying that national movements, while structuring national and sexual identities, often use tradition not only as a legitimating source of national identity, but also as a way of differentiating between the indigenous culture of the nation and the influence of the alien imperial culture. Casting a gender lens on this, one could easily see that how women in particular are seen as the keepers of the traditional culture that has the effect of circumscribing women in specific roles and protecting them from outside influence. So, in other words, through a gender lens, nationalism not only idealizes national manhood, the warrior, the protector of the nation, but also represents national womanhood as the guardian of the traditional order. And, this work builds on Partha Chatterjee's idea of the outer and the inner sphere. Now, having said this, one could argue that anti-colonial nationalism, as I would call it in India, constructed the women as custodian of national culture and tradition. And the chief tenets that defined this national culture was religion and vernacular language. So the Hindu religion here and its chief tenets, they came to represent the Indianness, and vernacular language was the means through which knowledge on Indian society was to be disseminated. Interestingly, and this is again something that we are all aware of, Hindu cultural practices stood in sharp opposition to both Islam and the new wave of Christianity, both associated with the alien invaders. Associated with this was the symbolic imagery, on which I have done a lot of work, which was used by Indian nationalists to maintain the distinctiveness of their respective cultures, and it drew upon deities from the Hindu pantheon. For example, the construct of Mother India, while homogenizing the nationalist movements, also projected a very desexualized, goddess-like imagery of the Indian woman. So features associated with, example, goddesses such as Sita and Savitri as self-sacrificing, benevolent, non-violent, all were associated with Mother India. What I would like to now suggest and connect is that how post-independent nationalism, as I would call it, since 2014, evokes the same symbolism of anti-colonialism, such as Bharat Mata. So, Narendra Modi's slogan, and that we live as one big family, or Mother India. But the idea here is, or the purpose here is, of creating a national identity that is predominantly Hindu. So I would like to now draw connections with the anti-colonial nationalism and the post-independence nationalism. It also projects India as fundamentally a Hindu society, and it defines Muslims and minorities as aggressors and outsiders. So here again you can see the semblance with the earlier anti-colonial discourse. The best workings of post-independence nationalism since 2014 can be seen in the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, which really provided a pathway of Indian citizenship for persecuted religious minorities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, who were Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, or even Christians. But this law did not grant any eligibility to Muslims from those countries. So, putting this and rounding this discussion up, I would say that notions of belonging and identity within the construct of the homeland is defined in terms of what is supposedly internal, exclusive, religious, and cultural. Such representational embodiment cannot be shared with non-national others.
Thank you for giving those insights and for setting the context so well. I think the historic aspect of moving to a slightly more comparative aspect of this conversation. As a scholar in feminist and colonial academia, you can surely appreciate the need for space in educational institutes for engaging in free and complex discussions around these subjects. What is your perception of that space within Indian universities, and if you would like to talk about your experience in Sweden and other countries where you have worked on in this context?
Thank you for that, Saeed. This is a debate that is very dominant right now in various academic quarters. So again, a very important question. I would like to hear give a little bit of the background that how to answer this question, one should be aware of how geopolitical contexts shape one's positionality in different ways. And I would like to start by saying that my own post-colonial positionality has been very much shaped through the legacy of my parents' anti-colonial activism during the 1940s against British rule in India. Now, the spatial colonial context of elite academic institutions, together with the domestic genealogies as a daughter of a nationalist household, gave post-coloniality an emotional and political salience. So, my answer to this question uses my personal yet subjective and mediated experience as an analytical resource to understand unfettered engagement with difficult subjects such as coloniality. And coloniality defined here as a mode of thinking, making, seeing, and interpreting the world that is dependent on the norms created and imposed by and in Western modernity. During my doctoral research in the UK and subsequent academic journeys in UK, Sweden, and South Africa, I developed a strong perception of unmarked white privilege, which allows one to ignore the ways in which their white racial identity holds specific advantages. In elite institutions of higher education, some Kikwano scholars have conceptualized this privilege as academic colonialism, referring to the monopoly of resources for academic enterprise by white, predominantly male-dominated academia, together with the imposition of their intellectual premises on subordinate groups, so other racialized groups, I mean. This context made me aware that, but also enabled me to question the racial inequality regimes in academia and how the production of knowledge was infused with relations of power which render some academic experiences legitimate and some illegitimate. Now, the current emphasis on decolonizing the academy, which draws again on both post-colonial and decolonial traditions, can be framed through this lens, which also incorporates here, besides UK, other European universities and beyond, such as South Africa, US, Chile, just mentioning the countries where I've had academic engagements and also experience of witnessing some of these developments. Now, just wanted to highlight here my recent engagement in the US, that how I noticed that historical social justice movements such as civil rights movements and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa have seen a resurgence in the form of hashtag BLM debates that feed back to decolonizing the academy globally, including India. If you one kind of sort of positions among the academic environment, specifically in Indian universities, the issue is at hand is to create an alternative and non-colonial mode of modernity. It requires from us as academics an attempt to reorient and decentralize practices of knowledge production and appropriation. So here the idea is, how do you do that? Not by having the West as the vantage point. In some academic conversations, it has been referred to as Asian Commons. And here, some of the emerging work of which I was a part of is by Dr. Chun Chun Ting at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and by Mithilesh Kumar at Christ University in Bangalore, which highlights the shared history of anti-colonial struggles and shared perspectives for socio-economic justice, but also in a way highlighting the myth of decolonization. So it also connects very well back to the question that Saeed posed previously on anti-colonial nationalism. So what is Asian Commons? What is the chief idea here? Basically, to understand Asian societies as reference points for one another, and which also entails a reorientation of knowledge from seeing the West as the inevitable future. So I think this is very important, important development that's taking place. If one was to again keep the focus on Indian universities and rethink about this continued disruption that I'm talking about, that we have to de-link from modernity, that we need to disrupt dominant modes of thinking, I would suggest that decolonial feminism offers an imaginary for new ways of being and for new ways of becoming, out of a temporal spatial bind that we have all inherited. And decolonial feminism is burgeoning in India, and I would say that with the full grasp, this would be of great benefit to the Indian Academy. Why I think decolonial feminism would be great for the Indian Academy is because it offers a lens to view issues from a critical standpoint, and this I would argue through my work on two different levels. First, it elucidates the achievements of modernity as inseparable from racism, from heteropatriarchy, from economic exploitation and discrimination of non-European knowledge system. It offers a very critical analysis of the main aspects of coloniality, whether we are looking at the ontological, the epistemic, or the gender dimensions. Yeah, and its subsequent offers an identification of decolonization in these spheres of reality. Yeah, the ontological, the epistemic, and the gendered. Second, decolonial feminism is really crucial for disrupting, as I started my discussion on disruption, and challenging institutional and structural racism, very kind of subtle and insidious in institutions such as in Sweden. So this epistemic disobedience allows for the deconstruction of the past, which is also something that Asian Commons is referring to. But at the same time, it allows an effective engagement in claiming a space for dialogic praxis through alliances, through languages and critiques that disrupt dominant logics and imaginaries in knowledge production. Finally, I would say that in Indian universities and also universities globally, we need to identify a pedagogy of emancipation, which entails unlearning in order to relearn.
Those are some really interesting conversations you just introduced. And thank you so much for sharing this in the context of your experience with us. I'm sure our listeners will find this conversation very engaging. And, it gives us a lot to think about the context of sociopolitics in India. So thank you so much, Dr. Suruchi, for all your engaging answers.
Thank you, Saeed. Thank you for very interesting, thought-provoking questions, which made me really think hard about the kind of work that I was engaged with. And I also would take the opportunity to thank Harpreet Kaur for facilitating this session. Thank you once again.
Thank you. You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.